So good evening. So tonight we are on to the penultimate talk in this 7-lecture series, and we're talking about some aspects of Mahayana Buddhism tonight. We're talking about the Paramitas and some other aspects of Mahayana. So up until now, what we've been talking about has been the core Buddhist teachings, which really are embodied largely in the Theravada school of Buddhism. And now we're going to go forward into the Mahayana, the northern school, and see how these teachings were developed. So just to remind you that the historical Buddha lived in the northern and central part of India, in what is now Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, and southern Nepal, and spent most of his life traveling up and down this particular part of India, up and down the valley of the Ganges. And it was only after the Buddha's death that his teachings started to travel. They traveled along the path of the Silk Route, traveled down into the southern part of the Indian subcontinent, and right on down into Thailand and on down into Malaysia and Indonesia. And as the teachings traveled, Buddhism acquired flavors of the various cultures and beliefs of the people in the areas where it was traveling through. So this map here shows the oldest school of Buddhism, shown by the green arrows. That's the Theravada school, or the school of the elders. And that's largely the teachings that we've been concentrating on to date in the course. But the teachings also traveled up along the old Silk Route through into Mongolia, Tibet, China, and then across into Korea and Japan, picking up aspects of the prevailing traditions and cultures along the way. And that part of the teachings is referred to as the Northern School of Buddhism, and comprises what we're going to speak about tonight, the Mahayana school, and also the Vajrayana school, which is mainly the Tibetan school. Mahayana means great vehicle, and there used to be a division between the southern school, which was called the Hinayana school, or the lesser vehicle, and the Mahayana school, which was the great vehicle. But nobody really uses the word Hinayana anymore, because it really is a bit pejorative. We simply talk about the Theravada school, the school of the elders. So let's look at these schools of Buddhism. So really there are 3 branches that we concern ourselves with. So the Theravada school, the way of the elders, this concentrates very much on the teachings of the Buddha, the things that were spoken through oral tradition and then written down. And that forms the largely monastic tradition of Buddhism, which you will find in Thailand and Sri Lanka. The Vajrayana school, Vajrayana meaning diamond vehicle, that is the school of Buddhism that took off in Tibet. And there was a lot of the traditions of the original Tibetan religion, the Bo religion, have become incorporated into that practice. But what we're going to concentrate on this evening is the large Mahayana school, which can be divided into the Zen school, which is centered in Korea and Japan, the Pure Land school, which is also in Korea, and also the Nichiren Buddhism school. So these later schools of Buddhism really developed the Buddhists' original teachings and took them a little bit further. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, that's all a bit of a con, isn't there? Surely there's only one Buddhism, and what are all these schools about? So let me give you a story which comes from the Lotus Sutra, which is one of the most influential of the Mahayana scriptures. And this is the story, the parable of the burning house. So this concerns a wealthy man, a wealthy merchant who had a very large house, and he had many children who were playing within the house. And one day the house caught on fire, and the merchant called to his children, children, come out of the house, you're in danger, come out, come out. But they were so busy playing with their toys and so distracted by toys that they didn't take any notice. They didn't listen to him. So they remained in the house in danger. So the wealthy merchant had to adopt a different tactic. And he said, children, come out. I've got wonderful things for you to see. I've got carts for you to play with. Some are pulled by goats, and some are pulled by deer, and some are pulled by horses. Come out and see the wonderful carts that I have for you. And the story goes that the children were immediately tantalized by the idea of these wonderful carts to play with. So they put down their toys and left the burning house and came outside to the place of safety. And what they found outside was there were carts, but there was only one type of cart. It was far more magnificent than the carts that the merchant had described to them. They were wonderful white carts covered in jewels, and they were pulled by oxen. And the story the teaching point of the story is that we are like those children inside the wealthy merchant's house, but we are in danger because the house is on fire. Remember the fire sermon? The house is burning with those passions of hatred, greed, and ignorance. But we're so distracted by the interesting things in the world and in our lives that we just won't put those things down and come away to the place of safety, to nirvana. So we have to be distracted by interesting things that are more compelling than the toys that we're playing with. And each one of us may have a different interest. So there were children in the house who wanted the goat cart, and there were children in the house who wanted to play with the deers. And that's what brought them out of the house. And in that same way, some of us are drawn to the Theravadan school of Buddhism, and some of us may be drawn to the Mahayana school. But when you get out of the burning house, when you get to the place of safety, when you get to nirvana, there was only ever one teaching, there was only ever one destination, but we all had different things that interest us to draw us out. And that's the parable of the burning house. And that really gives an idea about why these different schools of Buddhism exist and why they are all equally interesting and useful to us, but some of them look and feel a little bit different from other schools. So why did the Mahayana have to develop in the first place? What was the purpose of developing those teachings from the original Buddhist teachings? Well, the first thing to say is it's not saying anything different to what the Buddha originally taught. These are simply further developments of those core Buddhist teachings. But one important difference between the Mahayana schools of Buddhism and the Theravada school of Buddhism is that the Theravada school of Buddhism was very much centered around a monastic practice, and still is to this day. So you go to Thailand, you go to Sri Lanka, you see lots of monks in yellow robes or saffron robes, and the monks would be practicing and doing performing ceremonies and saying prayers. They were doing that for the benefit of the lay community who was supporting them. But just as in Christian religion, the priest was interceding on behalf of the people in the Catholic tradition, and eventually the Protestant Reformation said, no, we want to speak directly to God ourselves. We want to read the Bible in our own language. We want to understand these things for ourselves. In that same way, the Mahayana teachings allow lay practitioners to practice Buddhism and follow the path. And in fact, if you go to Zen temples in particular, you'll find that the priests there are not necessarily celibate. Many of them are married and have families, and in fact, the priest's temple may pass from the father to the son. The son may follow in the tradition, become ordained, become a priest like his father, and so it goes on. And there are many influential Buddhists throughout history who have been lay practitioners, or householders is another way of putting it, rather than being monastic. So this Mahayana practice is something that lay people can follow. You don't have to be ordained to do this. The doctrine of emptiness, I'm going to talk about a little bit more detail in a moment. Sunyata, which is a very important Mahayana teaching, and other difference between Mahayana and the Theravada schools is the development of the bodhisattva ideal, which I'm going to talk about quite a lot this evening. So let's talk about sunyata. Let's talk about emptiness. What do we mean by emptiness? This is a term that is actually greatly misunderstood, because it's very easy to think of emptiness as being synonymous with the void, with nihilism, with no existence. And that's actually a misunderstanding of what the term means. The sunyata is actually a development of principles that we've already explored earlier in the course. So the first of those principles is the principle of no self. We talked about the concept of a cart. A cart only exists as a cart when all its component parts are together in that particular configuration. And if you take the bits of the cart apart and dismantle it, the cart disappears, because it wasn't really there in the first place. It was just there when all of those things were together in that particular orientation. And in the same way, the human existence, the human experience, similarly, like the various component parts of a cart, is made up of these 5 aggregates or skandhas: the form, the body, sensation or feelings, perceptions, thought processes or mental constructions, and consciousness. And if you take all of those elements apart, separate them, or take really any one of them away, the human experience, the element, the thing that we think of ourselves, falls apart, because it wasn't actually there in the first place. It was only ever there as a construct of all of these 5 things, these 5 aggregates coming together. And yet we like to think, don't we, that there is somebody in the center of all of this, that there is a CEO behind all of this construct, someone in charge, someone who's watching the things that are being seen, who's feeling the things that are being felt. But that is actually a delusion. There is no me in the center of all that. I am simply a construct of the things that are brought together at this point in time. So that is the concept of no self. And the second element, really, of sunyata draws upon the concept of interdependence, which I have mentioned before, but I'll talk about it again, specifically around this particular teaching analogy, which is Indra's net. Now, Indra is a god from the very early Hindu pantheon, and it is said that he had a vast, infinite net which was cast over the world, over the universe, actually. And at each corner, each knot in the net was a jewel. And that jewel, when it was closely inspected, reflected all the other jewels in the net. Every single jewel was reflected in every single other jewel. And what this concept was reminding us is of the infinite ways in which we are interdependent with everything else that exists. So I cannot be here just simply alone, finite, and independent of everything else. I'm here because of the genetic material that my parents, which came together. I'm sitting in a house which was built by people. Actually, it used to be an old stables. In fact, this house, it's now a tiny little mews house. I'm sitting on a chair made out of wood, but that wood was originally a tree. That tree grew. Someone had to cut it down. You see, it goes on and on and on. You cannot conceive of how you yourself could possibly exist as you are now without all those myriads of dependent circumstances, all the things on which you rely to come together to be as you are now, tonight, sitting here, watching your computers, listening to me talk. None of these things could possibly have happened if it weren't for an infinite number of interdependent relationships that have come together to bring about where you are now, tonight. So that concept of you as a separate, independent self is an illusion. You are not separate and independent. You are dependent on so many other things around. The third thing we talked about, which feeds into sunyata, is the 12-link chain of dependent origination, which we talked about last time. And this basically tells us that everything arises as a consequence of something else, beginning with that original deluded way of seeing things, going through the mental constructs, going through thoughts, feelings, likes, dislikes, clinging, aversion. Everything comes to be as a consequence of something else that goes before. And so it goes on round and round and round. Nothing comes about, just arises out of nothingness. So you can see it's not a great leap of faith to go from the concept of no self, referring to myself as a human being, as a person, the concept of interdependence, the idea that I am dependent on so many other things around, and the concept of everything arising as a consequence of something else that went before. It's not very big leap to go from that to the concept of sunyata, which is that everything is empty. Even the minutest elements of human experience are empty. And we have to thank Nagarjuna, who is one of the greatest of Oriental, of Asian philosophers, for extending the no self teaching to this concept that everything, every element of our experience is empty of any separate, independent, infinite existence. We are all, everything that we know, everything that we experience is finite, is dependent, and arises because of something else that went before. So that really gets to the heart of what sunyata means. It's not a void, it's not non-existence, it's the fact that we are not, as we think we are, a separate, independent, infinite entity. We are totally dependent, and so indeed is every tiniest element of our experience. It arises because something else brought it about, and it will cease to be and set up a chain of something else happening, and so it will go on and on and on. And the concept of emptiness, of sunyata, is very nicely encapsulated in this quote from the Diamond Sutra. The Diamond Sutra is a very lovely Mahayana scripture, and actually one of the oldest dated and printed books in existence. And it's actually a very short sutra, so it's not a difficult one to read. And the very last lines of the Diamond Sutra are so lovely. Thus shall you think of this fleeting world, a star at dawn, a bubble in a stream, a flash of lightning in a summer cloud, a flickering lamp, a phantom, and a dream. And that really gets to the heart of this concept of things being empty of any intrinsic, independent self nature. So let's move on now to the concept of the bodhisattva ideal. So we talked about our Buddhist practice, the ultimate goal of Buddhist practice being to achieve awakening or enlightenment, to achieve nirvana, to get to that further shore, away from that cycle of endlessly rotating round through these 6 realms, from life to life, from situation to situation, that constant whirling around on the wheel of life is called samsara, and that is a suffering situation, a state in which people continue to suffer. And we would like to escape from that and get to a place where all of that ceases to repeat and repeat and repeat. And the goal of the Theravada practice is to achieve enlightenment, to achieve nirvana, to not have to go through cycle upon cycle of rebirth, circle after circle of misery around the wheel of life. And the person who's achieved this is called an Arahat or Arahant, depending on whether it's Pali or Sanskrit. So this is, if you like, almost a Buddhist saint. And if you read the very early Buddhist scriptures, you'll see that lots of people achieved enlightenment listening to the Buddha speak and became arhats and achieved awakened, achieved enlightenment, entered nirvana. They did not have to be reborn and keep on suffering. The Mahayana principles are not that is the goal of our practice, to simply achieve nirvana for ourselves. The Mahayana teaches something called the Bodhisattva ideal. So this on the right is a Bodhisattva. This is actually Canon or Guan Yin. The Bodhisattva is someone who has completed their training, finished the road of the practice, could enter nirvana and leave this world of samsara, but chooses not to. The Bodhisattva chooses to delay their own entry into nirvana until every sentient being has also achieved that point and can also be enlightened and enter nirvana as well. So the Bodhisattva practice is that we do this practice for the benefit of other sentient beings, for the benefit of all sentient beings, not for ourselves alone. So it's a different emphasis in the practice. And to have that aspiration to become a bodhisattva is called bodhicitta, body meaning awakening and citta meaning heart. Now, it will be very easy for you to be sitting there looking at the Arahat and the Bodhisattva and drawing comparisons between the two, but let's not be presumptuous. These are both fully enlightened beings. Just the emphasis of the motivation for the practice is different depending on whether you're in the Theravada school or the Mahayana school. So the four great vows, these really are the vows which practitioners in Mahayana schools will undertake to do. And in the Zen school, we would chant these every day, several times a day sometimes. These are the four great bodhisattva vows. Sentient beings are numberless. I vow to liberate them all. The afflicting passions are inexhaustible. I vow to overcome them all. The gates of the Dharma are manifold. I vow to enter them all. The way of the Buddha is supreme. I vow to walk it to the end. So we take these vows when we're training in the Mahayana schools, and they're very lofty ideals, aren't they? Numberless. Sentient beings are numberless. I vow to liberate them all. And in a sense, they are impossible things to do. And yet we vow, if we have the aspiration to become bodhisattvas, we vow to do these things. And a vow is a very important and special thing. We take marriage vows. We don't just say, yes, I'll marry you and I'll do my best. You say, I've taken a vow, we are going to be married and I've taken my marriage vows. Therefore, I take this promise I make to you very seriously indeed. This is a story. I like this story. It's a Japanese folk tale, and I really can't think where I found it now, but it's actually quite a nice story. It's the story of the Resolute merchant. So this is a story about a merchant who was walking along the seashore, and he had a very fine jewel which he was holding and he was admiring and thinking how very lovely this jewel was. And then suddenly from the depths of the ocean appeared a sea dragon. And the dragons love jewels. And the dragon saw this jewel in the merchant's hand, came up out of the ocean, grabbed it, and disappeared off down to the depths of the ocean. leaving the merchant to say, "Give me that back, that's my jewel, give it back." And the dragon said, "Make me." Anyway, sometime later, the dragon was curled up asleep on the floor of the ocean, and he heard this strange noise, this strange kind of noise. He thought, "What's that?" So he went up to the top of the sea, to the surface of the ocean, and had a look. And there was the merchant sitting on the beach with a little bucket, and he was taking water out of the ocean and tipping it away. And the dragon said, "What are you doing?" And the man said, "I'm going to drain this ocean dry. I'm going to drain this ocean dry. And when I have drained this ocean dry, I vow I will come down there to the seabed and I will kill you and I'll take that jewel back." And the dragon said, "Ridiculous. How can you possibly drain the ocean dry, silly man?" And the man said, "Well, I will do this in this lifetime. I will do it in the next lifetime. I will do it in the lifetime that follows. And eventually, I promise you that I will drain the ocean and I will come down and I will get you and I'll get that jewel back from you." And the dragon thought, "Oh, he's taken a vow. I better take this seriously." And he came back up to the sea, to the surface of the sea with the jewel, and he spat it out at the merchant and disappeared down to the depths of the ocean. So it's a fun story. It's a Japanese folk tale, but it shows the importance of a vow. If we take a vow, it's more than just an undertaking or an aspiration. It's a promise. So we're going to do this thing, and it sustains us and keeps us going along that path, even when the path seems extremely difficult. So we're going to talk now about the paramitas. Paramitas, the word means perfection. It also means crossing over. Now, I want to remind you about the parable of the raft that we talked about right back at the beginning of the course. The raft that the man put together to cross from this shore, the shore of danger, the shore of samsara, if you like, across the dangerous river to the further shore, the shore of safety, the shore of nirvana, if you like. And the paramitas are the vehicles by which we can cross over from this dangerous shore, the shore of suffering, to nirvana, the shore where the suffering will have ceased. And the paramitas are essentially, they are just another formulation of the Noble Eightfold Path. I'll show you how that works in a moment. But if we want to become a bodhisattva, if we have the aspiration to become a bodhisattva, then these particular attributes, the paramitas, the things that we need to perfect, the perfections, we need to develop these attributes and strengthen them and make sure that they're all brought on. And in the same way that we talked about the Noble Eightfold Path as being a little bit like spokes of a wheel, that when you're truing a wheel, you want all the spokes to be of an equal tension, otherwise the wheel rim gets really wonky and doesn't run true. In the same way, we work on these 6 paramitas concurrently, because each one gives strength to the others, and we have to build all of these things together. But they are simply another way, really, of talking about the Noble Eightfold Path. I'm going to go through them in a moment, but generosity, right livelihood, living a good life, maps onto that one. We're going to talk about discipline. We've talked about that already when we talked about right action and right speech. We've already talked about right effort. We've talked about wisdom. We've talked about concentration. So the elements of the Noble Eightfold Path, which is the Theravada formulation of how to follow a Buddhist path, really are mirrored in the 6 paramitas, which is really the Mahayana formulation of the same thing, walking the Buddha's way. So let's talk about them in turn. So the first of the paramitas we're going to talk about is Dhyana, Sanskrit term. This is generosity or giving giving and receiving, because sometimes it's as difficult to receive as it is to give. And so we try to work on how to not only give and be generous with time and money, but also how to be generous in receiving people's gifts and what people want to give to us. And traditionally, there are three things that a bodhisattva will give. There is the giving of wealth. So you might want to obviously make charitable donations and help out other people who are less well off than yourself. There's the giving of the Dharma, so teaching people about the Dharma, so teaching fellow Buddhists, supporting each other through Dharma talks. But also what is particular to a bodhisattva is the giving of fearlessness. Now, the bodhisattvas, when you see statues of the bodhisattva, they will have their hands held up like this. This particular mudra represents fearlessness. And it is very important that you understand that wherever there is fear, there is I. Whatever we fear is usually because we are protecting some aspect of our ego, of that concept of self. So to be fearless usually means you have lost that strong sense of needing to protect I, to defend I, to look after what is mine and defend it from you and yours and everything that is other. So bodhisattva giving of fearlessness is something that's very important to help us in our practice, because it's really getting away from that sense of protecting little me from the big scary world out there. The second of the paramitas is called Sila, and that really means taking skillful action, behaving skillfully. And we've talked about this already when we talked about right action, when we talked in the Noble Eightfold Path about right action. We talked about the 5 precepts that as a Buddhist we undertake to live up to. So we refrain from killing or harming other living beings. We refrain from taking things that are not freely given to us. We refrain from committing sexual misconduct or indeed any kind of manipulative relationship that makes other people subservient to our own needs and desires. So that goes beyond sexual misconduct. It goes really to any situation where we are really abusing another person who's in a weaker position than we are. We refrain from telling lies, so we try to be honest in our speech. We also try to be kind, and we try to avoid unnecessary idle chatter. And finally, we refrain from taking things that will cloud our minds, because obviously we're trying to work towards seeing things clearly, from having that clear seeing, seeing with the eye of wisdom. And that means not taking drugs, not getting drunk, and not intoxicating ourselves with all the other things that can carry us away. We can be intoxicated by ideas about fame. We can be intoxicated by getting lost into thoughts and daydreams. There are all sorts of things that will take away that clarity of thought, that clarity of seeing. Not just drugs and alcohol, but lots of other things will blind us to seeing things clearly and having that clear view that is part of the wisdom path. Kshanti, patient endurance, practicing patience. Well, what do we have to be patient about? Well, there are so many things in this world that we cannot change. And if you cannot change it, then you must endure it. So, for example, we were traveling yesterday down the motorway. It's kind of late afternoon, early evening, and I was pretty keen to get home because I was on the last bar of battery on my phone, and I was listening to a podcast. I knew that if we didn't get home quickly, I was going to run out of charge. And of course, you're traveling down the motorway, and then suddenly everything comes to a stop. We were just halted, 3 lanes of traffic just stationary. And of course, you've no idea why. You can't see anything or hear anything. You're just sitting there. Now, there are various things you can do. Clearly, you can bang on the steering wheel. You can shout. You can get out the car and stomp up and down the row of traffic. Or you can just accept it, because you can't change it. The traffic will move when it moves. There are other things that we can't really change and we just have to put up with. So one of the things, if you ever do a long meditation retreat, you end up sitting on a cushion or sitting in a chair for a long time, hours and hours sometimes. And honestly, it does hurt. Yes, it hurts. Your knees hurt, your back hurts. But you're not able to move and get up and walk around and disappear off from the discomfort. And you just have to put up with it. You just have to put up with it. So patience, endurance, practicing patience. If the thing that you are in proximity to, you can't really get away from it or change it, you just have to learn to put up with it and accept it. And there are so many things in life where we won't accept them and we don't think we should have to put up with it, but we need to practice this particular skill. Virya, engaging effort, right effort in the Noble Eightfold Path. One of the pictures I'd like to show in this talk is of this salmon, because this for me is this encapsulates what engaging effort really means. So you probably all know that salmon, when they have they are when they are adults in the great oceans and the time comes for them to spawn, they return to the original place upriver where they themselves were spawned. They somehow find their way back up the river, and they go tremendous efforts to get there. A salmon will travel up a river sometimes 1,000 miles. It'll leap up waterfalls, and there are things waiting for the salmon. There are the grizzly bears waiting for them. The fishermen are waiting for them. The eagles are waiting for them. Everything is waiting to grab the salmon, because everybody knows the salmons are coming. It's the great salmon run is about to begin. But does the salmon say, oh, do you know, I can't be bothered this year? Does the salmon leap up the first waterfall and go, enough already? I'll go back to the ocean. No, the salmon keeps going. It keeps going and going and going. And many of them don't make it, but some of them do. And they do it every year. And in a sense, that takes us back to that Bodhisattva vow. It is, of course, impossible to save all sentient beings or to enter all gates of the Dharma, etc. But we just have to make that effort to do it. And if we don't make the effort to do it, if we just flop back at the very least sign of resistance, as soon as our knees are hurting on the cushion or the tick has delayed us so we can't get to our Buddhist class, if we say, that's it, enough, I'm off, that's, you never get anywhere. You've got to keep going, got to make an effort. And I've got some words here from a Zen master, Master Hakuin, who speaks to engaging effort. So what he said was, the practice of the way is like making fire by friction. The essential thing as you rub wood against stone is to imply continuous all-out effort. If you stop when you see the first trace of smoke, you will never even get a flicker of fire, even though you may rub away for 1,000 years. So if anyone's ever tried to light a fire by rubbing a stick on a stone, you do have to keep going and going and going. You can't just pack in after a few minutes. Also, Master Hakuin, devote yourselves to penetrating and clarifying the self, in other words, into seeing things as they really are, as earnestly as you would put out a fire on the top of your head. Can you imagine that? How much effort you would put in if you had a fire burning on the top of your head? Are we making that effort in our Buddhist practice? I think not. But that is what engaging effort means for a Zen master like Master Hakuin. And finally, should you desire great tranquility, prepare to sweat white beads. So when you're in day 4 of your 5-day silent meditation and your knees are hurting, your back's hurting, prepare to sweat white beads. Jhana, the 5th of the 6 parameters, or meditation. Now, I'm not going to talk a great deal about this because we have a whole talk about meditation next week, and we will go into the hows and whys of meditation in a lot of detail. So I'm going to just park this one for now, if that's all right with you. And we'll finish with the last of the 6 parameters, which is prajna, or wisdom, which basically means seeing things clearly. And we've talked about this many times during the course. We've talked about that eye-deluded glass, which is all clouded, and we see things through that bias lens that is because I'm still thinking that there's an I and a me and a mine, and that's what motivates me. We have to learn to see things clearly, to see things as they really are, to see the world as it actually is, and this is wisdom. And this is the 6th of the parameters. Now, I'm going to finish with a very famous story, a Buddhist story, which I think really speaks to that aspect of wisdom. And it's the story of Kisa Gotami. It's a very well-known story, much beloved of Buddhists. So the story of Kisa Gotami concerns a young woman called Kisa Gotami who she was actually a fairly skinny, plain woman. I think Kisa Gotami actually means skinny little Kisa. Anyway, she eventually found herself a husband, got married, had a baby, and then disaster struck. First, her husband died, and then the baby died. And she went a little bit crazy. She wouldn't put down the body of the baby, of her dead child. She was carrying it around, weeping and wailing and sobbing. And her friends and neighbors found this incredibly disturbing. So they said to her, Kisa, there's a man teaching in the next village called the Buddha, and he can help you. Why don't you take your baby to see the Buddha and see what the Buddha can do to help? So she said, yeah, I will. So she went to see the Buddha with her dead child in her arms and said, please, 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 can you help me? Can you help me? My baby has died and this is all I have in the world. And he said, yes, I can help you. I can help you. She said, fantastic. What can I do? And he said, well, what you need to do is bring me a mustard seed and then I will help you. And she said, great, I'm off. I'll bring the mustard seed. He said, wait. The mustard seed must come and can only come from a house where no one has ever died. And she said, right, okay. And off she went into her village and went from house to house. Can I have a mustard seed? And everyone said, yes, of course you can. And she said, but has anyone ever died here? And they'd say, well, yes, my uncle died last year. You must surely remember that. Or my brother died, 2 years ago. Or my father died last week. Surely you remember. And there's no, I can't have. Then she went to the next house. Can I have a mustard seed? Has anyone died here? She went from house to house to house through the whole of her village. She could not find a single house where no one had ever died. So she went to the next village and the next village. It was the same story in every village. And eventually, at the end of the day, she was absolutely exhausted and ready to drop. And she finally came back to the Buddha and lay down the body of her child and said, now I understand. Now I understand. And it said that the Buddha had a tear in his eyes. And after that, she became a Buddhist. She followed him and and practiced what he had taught. So this is a story of someone who gave something very precious, gave up something very precious to learn an element of wisdom, to learn about the universality of grief, that we all grieve, we all lose people. That's part of human life, but she didn't see it, she didn't see clearly, but eventually, having gone on this terrible journey, coming back to the Buddha in exhaustion, she saw things as they really were, that death is part of life and that we all experience it. So I'm going to leave this there for tonight, but I'm going to give you a last bit of homework. I think, having done 6 weeks of the course, you are now ready to do a little bit of bowing. A little bit of bowing. Now, why on earth do we bow? Well, bowing is very important in Buddhist practice, and it isn't bowing in terms of worship, but it is bowing in terms of a little bit of respect for something that's more important than ourselves. And it's very interesting how incredibly resistant people are to bowing. I don't know if they're on this course, but I have a couple of friends who found the whole bowing thing when they first came to a class very, very difficult. What do we bow to? Well, certainly in the Zen school, we bow to everything and everything. We bow to the Buddha. If you're really het up and in a terrible state, you might even bow to the toilet. There's something very powerful about getting your head down, which helps you. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to try this. I'm going to ask you to try it specifically when those overwhelming passions that you're carried away by anger, by dislike, by envy, when the emotions have really got a hold of you, rather than letting rip with it and shouting and stomping around or going into a sulk, just bow. Now, you don't need to make a big song and dance about this so that people say, what are you doing? Even the tiniest thing, you can just drop something on the floor and bend down to pick it up. Just get your head down a little bit lower than things around you, because it puts a totally different perspective on what you are going through. And you have to believe me when I say this, but I have spent more time in my workplace in the toilet with the door locked behind me, bowing to the toilet when I'm so overwrought. And it just changes. I want you to try this. You might try it when the emotions, when those passions are really flaring. This is a way of giving into them and letting them go. You might try it when you're transitioning from one place to another. We talked about going through the 6 realms. Maybe when you transition from one room to the next, as you cross the threshold, just maybe a little pause and a bow. Just try that and see how that works for you, because can be incredibly helpful. But this isn't an act of worship. We're not bowing to something out there in a godlike sense. We're just bowing for the sake of bowing, if you like. So I'm going to ask you to try that. Now, I'm going to stop sharing now because we have just got a few minutes left for some questions, if you have any questions for me.
Hi, Rachel. Yes, we do have quite a few questions in the chat. Thank you for this very nice lesson, first of all. So the first question is asking, how can you decide which school of Buddhism to follow?
How can you decide? Well, you can try them. So I would suggest that you do some classes at the Buddhist Society or another group. We'll talk next week about the various other places that you might want to explore. You might find there are certain schools that appeal in the way that those different carts appealed to those different children. So if you like the idea of the monastic tradition, living a good life, an ethical life, following that moral code, you might find the Theravadan practice is more harmonious to you. If you like a little bit of ritual, a little bit of incense, some bells and smells and paintings, you might find the Tibetan school is interesting to you. If you like to sit on a cushion and have some formality in your life, you might find the Zen school. But you need to try the different practices out. But once you have found one, then please stick with it. Otherwise, you're like the salmon up the stream and then flopping back down again. You have to keep going, because you will find whatever school you settle into, and one of them will call to you. One of them will say, this is it, this is the one. Once you've found it, there will be difficulties along the way. It'll start, marvelous, wonderful enthusiasm. I'm going to sit for 23 hours a day in silent meditation. And eventually the novelty wears off and you get a bit fed up with it, and you think, I might try, fed up with Zen, I think I might try the Theravadins now. Don't do that. Just keep going, because you've got to push through those difficulties. There will be difficulties. You've got to push through them. But one of the schools will appeal, will draw you. And it depends what sort of person you are. I like folding things, so I was obviously always going to do Zen, wasn't I? I'm so tidy. Look at my tidy house. But there are certain ones that really will appeal, and certain ones that won't. So I would suggest try a few different classes, and then suddenly you'll think, oh yeah, this is the one for me.
Thank you very much, Rachel. So the next question asks, thank you for this evening session. Please, would you be able to talk about how social justice fits in with Buddhism?
Social justice?
Yes.
I'm trying to think of an example. I'm not sure what you mean by social justice. That's the trouble. I haven't understood the question. Could I have a different one, Lavinia? And perhaps that person could rephrase it so I understand. Give me an example of what you mean, and I'll try and,
of course,
explain.
Sorry. Okay, so the next question. I am struggling to understand the concept of working towards where all sentient beings have reached nirvana and therefore no longer need to return to human life, if I've understood that correctly. So if we are empty and purely created by the set of circumstances we come from, how does it follow that we return over and over until we have reached enlightenment?
Because we don't believe that we have Buddha nature. This is the problem. We are told at the very beginning that you are all sentient beings are uniquely endowed with the wisdom and power of the Tathagata. You all have Buddha nature. In a sense, we already are enlightened. We already are where we want to be, but we just can't see it. We just can't believe it. We think it's for someone else, not ours. We'll never get there. The point of achieving this awakening, this enlightenment, it's not to get something that we don't have. It's to recognize something that we already do have. So there's a story of an old beggar who's sitting at the side of a road. He's sitting on an old box, and he's begging for money. And a traveler comes past and is about to give him some money. Then he says, "What's in the box?" And the beggar says, "I don't know. I've never looked." And the traveler says, "Well, why don't you look now?" So he opens the box and have a look. And inside it's full of treasure. That beggar had been sitting all his life on a box full of treasure, and he'd never bothered to look, so he didn't know. In the same way, we are all sitting on a treasure, which is our own Buddha nature, which we have, but we have lost sight of it. We no longer believe that we have it. So we are trying to get back to where we originally were. We are trying to get down to that intrinsic nature, which is our Buddha nature. And we are trying to help other people, other sentient beings to get there as well. So I hope that gives you an inkling of what we're getting at when we try to do our practice. It's not to be something that we're not now, but it's to get back to where we always were, because you are already there. You just don't know it. You haven't seen into that. So we're trying to awaken to that reality of our own intrinsic Buddha nature and to help other people get there too. So that's the Bodhisattva ideal, but really the point is that we are already where we want to be, when we always were, but we just can't see it.
Thank you very much. So we have a follow-up from the previous question. So by social justice, I mean working towards a fairer world, for example, in terms of equality of race, sex, wealth, etc.
Yeah, so this is part of the Buddhist practice, is to work with compassion to help other sentient beings, so that everybody, ultimately, there's a reduction in suffering for all. And this means living an ethical life, living a good life, not harming other things, not taking things from other people, etc., etc. But when this is tainted with selfish desire for me, then it is no longer skillful. So we can certainly work towards a more harmonious life. We can work towards welfare for all sentient beings. We can work towards peace and harmony. But once it gets tainted, as it so often does, by selfish desire, by those burning fires of wanting this and not wanting that, then it is no longer wholesome or a useful thing to do. So we can and should strive towards a better world for ourselves and for everyone else. But please, let's not put that into a situation where we are wanting those things for our own selfish ends, to make me feel better, to make me look better, to make everything better for me. Because as soon as that starts to creep in, as it so often does, then it's no longer skillful. It's no longer really in tune with a Buddhist practice. So there are many things we can do and perhaps should do. We don't all have to go and sit in a cave for 5 years and meditate there, but we can do lots of other things to be helpful in the world. But let's not be selfish and driven by my own desires to make myself more important, feel better, look better. You can very easily taint those positive motivations with selfishness and make that sense of I, that sense of ego stronger. And we really need to be careful about that. So please do try to do good works, but don't try to force these things on other people if they're not willing to accept it. Try not to be doing harm to other people while you're going about your business. It's no point in literally fighting for world peace and killing other people while you're doing it. That's you've missed the point there. So yes, you can and should do it, but please just keep the selfish nature, keep self out of it if you can. We can maybe have one more, Lavinia, and then we'll wrap up.
So the last question I have is actually quite similar to the first. So it's about traditions. And it reads, as we begin to learn to practice Buddhism, does it matter which of the traditions we initially start to follow? So, for example, should we start with the Theravada approach, as it is the oldest tradition? However, it seems as if the core principles of each brand of Buddhism are similar, but just formulated in different ways.
Yeah, exactly. So the point is that the core teachings at the root of all of these religions are exactly the same. You will have the 3 signs of being, You'll have the three fires, you'll have the Four Noble Truths, the Noble Eightfold Path. These are fundamental to all of those different Buddhist groups. Then there are different, if you like, trimmings go along with it. People might dress in a different way. There might be different rituals, different core literature that's being read, different ways of, chanting, whatever it might be. There are some superficial differences, but deep down, if you are a Buddhist, you're a Buddhist. You don't have to be a Zen person or a Theravada person or a Tibetan person. You just can be a Buddhist. And there are certain schools of Buddhism which superficially look a little bit different from others, but they should all have that very, very same root. You remember Yokadaishi, let us not concern ourselves with the branches, let us just take hold of the root. That's what we should be thinking about, is those core Buddhist teachings, and then ultimately adding on the different refinements in the different schools by all means. But please don't lose sight of those core principles which are at the heart of all Buddhist schools. I'm going to wrap up there because it's over time now, and next week we will talk about meditation, and we'll talk about some of the different schools of Buddhism and where you might take this next. Just to say, we would normally do a little Buddhist meditation as part of next week's class, but there are lots of other courses online through the Buddhist Society where you can do that. So I'm probably not going to do that, which means there will probably be a little bit more time for Q&A next week. So if you've got burning questions that I haven't got round to answering, then there will be a little more time next week to answer those questions. But I'm hoping next week that we'll look at meditation and why we meditate and how we meditate and what you might do going forward from here. So we'll leave it there for now. See you next week. Bye-bye.